Welcome. My name is Oliver Rosales. I'm a professor of history at Bakersfield College. I'm here with James Gregory, professor of history at the University of Washington, and Andrew Bond, who's a professor of English at Bakersfield College, helping run our tech. Going to be stable for the rest of the evening, we promise. So I just want to jump right in and introduce our speaker. I know everyone is eager to hear him, as am I. James Gregory is professor of history and director of the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium at the University of Washington. He is the author of numerous articles and prize-winning books, including American Exodus, the Dust Bowl Migration and Okie Culture in California, and the Southern Diaspora, How the Great Migrations of Black and White Southerners Transformed America. The role of social movements and their impact on politics and communities has been another research interest and led to the creation of the Mapping American Social Movements Project, an online resource for exploring the history and geography of dozens of civil rights movements, labor movements, and women's movements. This is one of the 12 online projects that are part of the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium that was launched in 2005. Most recently, Professor Gregory has led the Racial Restrictive Covenant Project, which identifies, maps, and publicizes the racist property restrictions that were a primary instrument of racial segregation and subordination in Washington, California, and in many other states. And so again, to reiterate, during the presentation, you're welcome to drop any comments or questions in the Q&A, blow up the chat box. Andrew and I will certainly monitor them. And then we'll also save time for some dialogue with our speaker after his presentation. So welcome, James Gregory.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Rosales, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I should tell those who are with us, who I can't see, but I wish I could, that this is going to be complicated. Oliver asked me to do kind of everything. It was like, well, tell us about your books and tell us about your projects, and especially save some time to talk about the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project, which is something that you all in Bakersfield might want to take on as well. And congratulations, Oliver, to the Mapping Common Ground, Agriculture, Migration, and Labor in Rural California. That promises to be really, really important project. So thank you all. I'm going to share my screen and try to navigate through websites, which is usually not what I do. I usually use PowerPoints. So are we seeing this, Oliver?
Oh yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay, great. So here's the title of the talk. Ever since I started listening to Merle Haggard, I've liked the phrase born in Bakersfield. So I'm tempted to start with that. Not that I was actually born in the literal sense in Bakersfield. I was born in Palo Alto, 250 miles away. And as a coastal Californian, I knew little about Bakersfield until 1979. I'd probably passed by on the way to the mountains, but never saw a reason to stop and look around. That changed in 1979 when, as a graduate student at UC Berkeley, I needed a dissertation topic. And knowing nothing more than John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, I decided to research the Dust Bowl migration. Since Steinbeck had started in Kern County, I thought I would too. And being young and thoughtless, I waited until mid-August to begin this research trip. And being young and poor, I had almost no funds to pay for lodging on that first trip. So guess where I stayed? I don't know, you'd have to be pretty old to recognize the Topper Motel or Motor Hotel. I found this picture as I was starting to prepare the talk. It's a postcard from the 1950s when the Topper Motor Hotel was, I guess, nice or something. But by 1979, it wasn't. There wasn't any swimming pool. There wasn't any air conditioning. What it was cheap. I think I paid $9 a night. Imagine that. But on the other hand, throughout my 3 weeks in Bakersfield, it averaged 109 degrees. Now, I know you folks in Bakersfield think that's nothing, but coastal Californians, we wilt. And here is a picture I found today of that current site. This is on Union Avenue and now the Plaza Motel. I suspect the motor topper was knocked down probably a week after I left. In any case, the other thing I did, and the way I survived, or at least this is my memory, was I hung out a lot at the Safeway on Union Avenue. I don't know if it's still there, mostly with the frozen vegetable department, trying to bring down the core body temperature. So that was, that's kind of my start. But my trip to Bakersfield in 1979 really was formative in my life. And so I want to use that phrase, born in Bakersfield, in an academic sense. My academic career literally was born in Bakersfield. Here's another picture. That's kind of what I looked like. We're talking 35, 40 years ago. Anyway, just you can see times change, especially for me. What I did, and this is also the place to say thank you to any of the amazing folks in Bakersfield. I don't know if Christy Gavin is around anymore, or Sharon Goldsmith and Todd Moquist, and the folks who of the California Odyssey Project, the interviews, that amazing collection at Cal State Bakersfield, and other interviews I did. Anyway, all of that was very formative. So what I went to California thinking I was going to follow John Steinbeck's footsteps, but being in Bakersfield, I quickly realized that there were whole different, really different issues. And I, in my work over the next 10 years before publishing American Exodus, I rethought the whole way of understanding the Dust Bowl migration, and realized that Steinbeck had absorbed and reproduced really unhelpful stereotypes of people involved. So here are some of the photos published from this book. The book reframed the Dust Bowl migration, which had been understood by Steinbeck and others as a tragedy. I was more interested in the cultural and political legacy of this huge migration from one region of the country to another. In Bakersfield in 1979, I saw that the story of the Dust Bowl migration had not ended in the 1930s and was not only about economic struggles of the hundreds of thousands of migrants, it was also about their social challenges and what they created in California. As I wandered through Arvin and Oildale and Bakersfield, I saw part of that legacy. I described it in the book as an Okie subculture forged out of the social hostility and stereotypes imposed on migrants from that region, the Western South. It was clear then, and it became part of the way I understood the book, that this subculture was continuing into the next generation. So I explored some of the ways that Oklahomans, Texans, and Arkansans had changed California, establishing Southern Baptist and Pentecostal churches, fostering country music, and developing a political tradition that I called plain folk Americanism, which combined populist suspicions of elites and the privileged with white supremacist and nativist commitments. I wrote this many years ago, and as I looked over it again in the past few days, I see things that I would rethink and change, and not too big, but some. The other thing that kind of really attracted me about talking to you all was the possibility that I could learn something about how things have changed since. I really haven't spent any time in the Central Valley since moving to Washington State almost 30 years ago. So I'd love to know how things are in Bakersfield and whether this subculture still exists, what things survive from the 80s when I was doing this research, what kind of accents could be heard on the streets of Kern County today? Has the Bakersfield sound survived the passing of its founders? So in the Q&A, maybe you all can help me with that. After publishing that, I continued to work on issues of migration and other subjects. You can see the 4 books that I've either authored or edited. The Seattle General Strike and the Upton Sinclair book are about social movements, which is a thing that I've really been focusing on for quite a while now. But the most important book I wrote was The Southern Diaspora. And in many ways, this is an outgrowth of American Exodus, but in a much expanded frame. So in the Southern Diaspora, I changed the focus to the great migrations of Black Americans out of the South, while comparing it to the migration of white Southerners. And this represented a broadening of issues that I'd first explored in American Exodus, broadening racially and geographically, and broadening the historical significance. This book tracks the migration of 28 million Southerners, a huge population of Southerners. Doing the numbers, it was as if the whole states of Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky had left. 28 million people over the course of the 20th century. And the book tracks their experiences, but more importantly, explores the transformative impact of these twin great migrations, impact on American politics, life, religion, and culture. California was only one of the states that appears in Southern Diaspora, but I found some important stories there. And these pictures begin to tell. In fact, the book, the very first part of the introduction, starts with a vignette about Jesse Unruh and Willie Brown, who some of you may know are two of the most important, most powerful figures in California politics in the late 20th century. Unruh, whose nickname was Big Daddy, was the Speaker of the Assembly in the 1960s and ran the legislature like it was his own fiefdom. Willie Brown was a brand new legislator when this picture was taken. He was the first Black legislator from San Francisco, and he immediately tangled with Big Daddy. Journalists in the years that followed loved to tell the story of how Jesse and Willie started out as enemies, then grew to respect each other, and then in the following decade, Willie replaced Jesse and became the longest-serving speaker of the Assembly in California's history. And he later became mayor of San Francisco. Now, what journalists did with this story was they made it into a story of Black Californians achieving political influence in the 1980s, finally breaking into the white political establishment. And it was. What I did with it was a little different. I retold the story, adding a new dimension. Neither Jesse nor Willie were part of the establishment. Neither were Californians. Both were Southerners. Indeed, both were from Texas, both coming to California as young men looking for opportunities. Both were part of the Southern Diaspora. The book uses that pairing and several other pairings to explore the separate but linked experiences and impacts of the twin migrations, showing how Southern migrants transformed American religion. And here are two of the most famous preachers who came north out of the South and established evangelical missions and big evangelical enterprises in the North and the West, Billy Graham and Reverend S.C.L. Franklin. Two different versions of evangelical Protestantism, the white one and the Black version. The Southern Diaspora transformed politics in many, many ways. The civil rights initiatives and Black power movements all were they were founded, based, and most importantly, anchored in the North, where they were produced by Southern migrants like Jesse Jackson, who had moved to Chicago. And the white politics, the angry white politics of George Wallace and other populist conservatives who of the 1970s also flowed with the Southern Diaspora. It was in the communities of expatriates in the North, people who were called hillbillies, and in the West, people who were called Okies, were the sort of fostering population. Not that all white Southerners approved of George Wallace, but George Wallace found his most eager supporters in Southern white expat communities. And then the last pairing I show you here is has to do with music. Now, Southern American music is Southern music. In the 20th century, virtually all forms of popular music, whether it's blues, jazz, soul, rock and roll, country music, they all were formed in the South. Those are all Southern products before they became American fascinations and support. But the story of that is often told as if this just starts in the South and then magically moves to the North. And in fact, it's diaspora Southerners of both races who did it, who produced the kind of music that nationally appealed to people. And that pairing works pretty well when we think about Aretha Franklin and Merle Haggard, in part because they're not actually diaspora Southerners. They're second generation, both of them born outside the South as part of communities formed in the diaspora. Merle Haggard born in Bakersfield, Aretha Franklin growing up in Detroit. And it works in another way because in the 1960s, these two were very formative in changing the nature of these music forms, soul on the one hand and country on the other, and making them more politicized in ways that show the tensions as well as the overlaps between the two migrations. So Aretha Franklin in 1967 released RESPECT, Respect, which becomes an anthem for Black pride in the years that follow. And Merle Haggard 2 years later answers with Okie for Muskogee and Working Man's Blues, which are anthems to the sort of angry conservative white working class. So again, parallel but different in tension, but so that's the point, and that's the logic, and that's the form that book takes. Now Oliver really wants me to talk about the digital work that I've been doing now for quite some time. So about 20 years ago, I began to create online digital public history projects. And this represents something that, I and a lot of historians really want to do. In our work as professors and researchers, we are expected to publish books and articles in academic presses and academic journals. And this is really important this is totally important because this kind of work and publishing is how new knowledge is created, how new things are discovered and verified through the academic channels. But a lot of us also want to reach broader publics and to take information and that is produced by academics, but make it more available. And the online publishing makes that possible. So about 20 years ago, I started creating projects, all of them created with students. And over the years, the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium, and you're seeing it here, has involved hundreds of University of Washington students, undergraduates and graduates who do research and often are published and help with maps and all sorts of things. So when I talk about my projects, I really have to make it clear that it's not. These are projects that so many people and colleagues at the University of Washington have helped with, and community groups have helped with. So there are about 12 of these projects on the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium, and you're seeing them sort of flip by the different ones. Many of them are locally focused. They're focused on Seattle, Washington, Pacific Northwest. But three of them, or three or four, have a national focus. And I thought, because I want to bring the California work to you. So I'm going to talk about the America's Great Migration Project, the Mapping American Social Movements Project, and lastly, the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project. So the America's Great Migration Project obviously grows out of the two books and the other work I've done on migration, but it's now making things public, and it's showing the volumes, for the most part, and destinations of migrations. So there are a number of map complexes and little articles about Black migrations, Latinx migrations, Asian American migrations, the Southern Diaspora, the Dust Bowl migration, and then state-by-state migration histories. I want to show you the Latinx migrations, which I think is very relevant to the Central Valley and California, and certainly Kern County. So here is part of the page, and what we get to, or when I say mapping projects, these are interactive maps that show, in this case, state by state, the dimensions, the size of Hispanic, Latino populations in each state, and track this decade by decade. So I don't know if I hope it's going to work. You can see the size, the number grows, and over here you see national or national backgrounds, not national origins. These are not people moving from Mexico. These are ethnic Mexicans, ethnic Cubans, and the like, the diversity of Latinx populations. And so you can here, let's see if I can get this to scroll a little bit. So here for California, you see the distribution really heavily Mexican, as in the most recent census, but Florida, really different populations. New York, really different. And anyway, decade by decade. And there are other parts here that are of importance. So those were the national backgrounds, but not where people were born. Here, you can see state by state, the percentage of Californians born in the US versus immigrants from Latin America, and the different distributions in other states. So, and there's more here, but this is something that is being widely used now in schools and for all sorts of people. And I should say these projects all together just have an astounding popularity. We register about 1.5 million page views each year on this whole complex of projects. So another part of the Great Migrations Project are the state-by-state histories of, and here is the migration history of California from 1850 to 2008, and there's a kind of an overview narrative about this, but it comes down to these charts. Now here, I'm not showing maps, I'm showing a chart in this interesting, box formation that visually tells you pretty quickly where people were born. So 2018, this is California's population of 39 million people, and about half were born in state. And then these are the leading, you can see the numbers over here: Mexico, Philippines, China. Now, if you look back in 1960, let's say, you see really different. For one thing, there are very few people from out of the country, born out of the country. You can see a lot of Texans and Missourians, and the native born, the California born part is much smaller. So California has grown, and it used to be a migration state where everybody was from somewhere else, not any longer. And let's see, I'm having some trouble. And here you can see where California born people have moved to, these different states. And all of this can be sorted and selected by the major racial and ethnic population. So, and then I want to show you one more. I actually want to bring it closer to Kern County. So we also have the ability to show county by county these migration histories. Again, back to the beginning. And here's Kern County. And this would be Kern's population, mostly California born, Mexico being next, along with Texas. But if you go back to the time period that that I was talking about, the Dust Bowl migration, here's the very different look at Kern County's population then. Then just about a third or less of the population was born in California. Everybody's from somewhere else, and especially they're from Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Arkansas. And you can see the numbers here. And then you can move this through, so that's we can move through 1960 and 1980. And here you see the Dust Bowl population kind of topping out in 1980. The numbers have grown bigger, but the migration after 1980 is really not going to be a big part of Kern County's changing population. By 1980, and that's when I was starting to do the research, second generation and third generation Dust Bowl migrants are part of this California-born picture. Now, the other thing here that's pretty interesting is to look at the changing origins of Latino, Hispanic populations, and as well as the numbers. So in 1980 here, the Latinx population is starting to grow, not just Kern County, pretty much everywhere, and it's going to grow and grow and grow ever since. But here and in every decade since, you can see that most Latinx folks are California-born. More from Mexico, but not by any means the majority. And here's the most recent distribution. Again, overwhelmingly California-born, plus other states, Texas and the like. So this is something that you all can play around with. I think Oliver's going to put some links in. Again, this is a great, for those of you teaching classes or taking classes, these tools help us understand quite a lot about our demography and our history together. I want to switch to a different project that has been that I've been working on for the last 7 years, and Oliver mentioned this in the introduction. So a lot of my research has been about social movements, about why they matter, how they work, how social movements influence political parties and political decisions and help make history or don't make history. And so some of this has been theoretical work, but the other part of it is this, the Mapping American Social Movements project, again, helped by lots and lots of students in the last 7 years. And the point here is to explore not just the history, but the geography of social movements. And the reason for that is that a lot of what's written by historians, political scientists, sociologists, and the like doesn't consider geography. It talks about a movement like the Socialist Party or the NAACP as if it's just a national thing. And what that really means is they're doing most of their research in New York. And then they say, oh, yeah, okay, here it is. And all they know is what really was happening in New York. So social movements have different geographies. Some really are very national, others are very regional and very local and things like that. And that matters, that changes what they can accomplish and how they work. So the point here was to do that kind of work and be able to explore and show this geography. And you can see we've gone through a lot of social movements and produced these visual maps and other data about them. So there are lots of different kinds of civil rights movements, women's movements, labor movements, immigrant rights movements, anti-war movements, all sorts of different, about 50 or 60, I forget how many we have. But I want to show you one that matters a lot to Kern County. So we actually have a complex of Chicano movements, including showing Mecha, the Brown Berets, LULAC, all these geographies of different movements that became important, throughout the 20th century. And here's one. Here's the United Farm Workers. And in this case, what we've done is gone through newspapers and records from the UFW to find events that the UFW was associated with: strikes, boycotts, protests of various kinds. And here, hundreds of them appear on this map. And here is a description of them, and you can click on a dot and find out more about, well, anyway, yeah, you can see a little bit about it, and you can move year by year through this. Now, the geography here is pretty interesting. I mean, there were UFW actions in Texas and elsewhere, but wow, this is a very West Coast movement, right? And even more, it's California, and as you know, even more, it's the Central Valley. So here's the California linked map, and this is starting with what do we have here? 1965, and you can go to 1966 and see these events and see how many, so Delano, this is, Kern County is ground zero for the UFW. And you can follow things month by month, and also a timeline. Anyway, so this, I hope, would be something that might be useful to a lot of you interested in farm workers, and maybe Oliver, with your project, we can sort of link this up or do something interesting together with that.
Hey, Jim, can I interrupt you? Because there's a great question from the chat. So Wendy Garay is a local teacher in Bakersfield, and she asks, is there work being done to map social movements of queer LGBTQ people in California?
Well, not by my group. We have done a fair amount of work about the LGBTQ activist movement in Seattle. And we have interviews and a lot to expose that really important, but it's locally focused. It's part of the project called the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project. And we have on the mapping project, a lot of this depends on students. And when I can get students, graduate students or undergraduates interested and raise some money, then we do something. And it often depends on what the student wants to do. And so for a while, there was a student who then left who wanted to do LGBTQ movements. And they produced the start of a map of publications from the 1950s on, and another about the I forget the other one. Anyway, but we got stalled when they left, and that's kind of what I do. When students want to do things, we do them, and when they don't, I want to anyway. So that's a great question, and it prompts me to. It reminds me, of things that need to be done.
Thanks, Jim.
So, Oliver, time for racial restrictive covenants?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So the most recent thing, it's also one of the older things I've done, is the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project. But over the last 2 years, with funding from the legislature, first time, a lot of money, I've had a team of 6 and 7 students working on locating racial restrictive covenants in Washington State. So for those of you who don't sort of know exactly what a racial restrictive covenant is, what for much of the 20th century, property owners were allowed and even encouraged by the real estate industry, and for that matter, the states and federal government, to impose restrictions on who could buy, rent, or occupy their property. Restrictions that would be imposed on future owners. So it's not just, I won't do this, but no future owner of the property can ever rent to a person of color, sometimes also to Jewish people. Restrictions had a lot of different dimensions, but the bottom line is that they typically were whites only. And these existed in all states, and as I said, was actually promoted by the real estate industry for years and years and years. Here's an example of one in a Seattle community. You can see there's a whole list of restrictions. But the racial one says no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in the whole or in any part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. And then it goes on, except a domestic servant actually employed by a person of the white or Caucasian race, where the latter is an occupant of such property. So that's kind of typical. We found lots that are more specific, that only talk about Chinese people or African Americans, although they use racist, really disgusting terminologies. And we found one that prohibited anybody but Aryans, Hitler's Nordic Aryan race theory but the other thing that you can see here is that, and this association is disgusting and revealing at the same time, first no people of color, then here are all the animals who can't be part of this. So what's important about these is this was a form of segregation and subordination that had really lasting implications. It's not the only tool that segregationists use, but it was legal. It was enforced by the courts. It was sponsored by state governments who registered these restrictions as part of property records, and they supposedly bound that property, and all future owners, even if a future owner wanted to sell or lease, the threat of a lawsuit would stop it. So really an insidious, very powerful form of segregation. And so our project began actually some 20 years ago 15 years ago to look for these. But with state funding a couple of years ago, we've really made a lot of progress. So in Washington state, so far, we've identified 50,000 properties that were marked locked up by racial restrictive covenants. And here is Seattle and King County. Come on, come back. The maps get a little finicky. Okay, these are maps, paired side-by-side maps of King County, of Seattle and neighboring King County. And on the left, you see subdivisions, and it tells you how many properties approximately and the nature of the restriction. And on the right, if we zoom in, you can see parcels, the actual streets where all these restrictions were imposed. And these are still part of property records. As of 1968, they're void. The 1968 Fair Housing Law passed by Congress says it's illegal to discriminate in rental or sale of property, even though, of course, it's still pretty common, but it's at least illegal. And so all of these racial restrictions are no longer supposed to matter, but they're still in the property records. And it's really unnerving, I think, especially for people of color, to see, they buy a house or they want to buy a house and they find out, oh, this is a restricted neighborhood or was a restricted neighborhood. So the legislature in our state is trying to do something about this. The other thing I was going to say is so this is 50 years ago, right? That's what people say. Oh yeah, that's history. What does history matter? Well, historians think it matters, but in this case, it really does matter because the legacy of these restrictions lives on today in the disparate homeownership rates by race that are really appalling and all too apparent and finally getting some attention. And the reason that's the case is that for decades, white families of modest means were encouraged and able to buy homes, while these restrictions narrowed the little areas where families of color could purchase homes. And redlining, which had to do with banks not making mortgage loans in some areas, redlining was the second weapon that prevented families of color from purchasing homes. Consequently, all the way up to the 1970s, when those things supposedly became illegal, it was very, very difficult for Black and Latinx and Asian and Indigenous families to purchase homes. Well, whites could. And over the generations, then, home ownership wealth has trickled down through part of the population, but not the other. So here are some statistics, again, for Seattle King County that show the differential home ownership rate. And the blue represents Black families, red, white families, green is Latinx families. And you can see, and the trend line shows the decline in home ownership among African Americans in King County. Once it was 46%, it's always been way, way below white home ownership rates. But now it's only 27%. And that's because property values have blown through the roof in the generations since things became supposedly more open. And nowadays, the only people who can afford a home have to have really big incomes, or they have to have family wealth. Their grandparents had to have owned a home, and their parents had to have owned a home, and all that trickled down. So here's another chart that we showed to the legislature. So here we're looking at Black families and white families by income. So these are families that earn a good income, 150,000 or more, and there's still a differential. But when it gets more modest, the income level, say 75,000 or less, the differential is huge. Look at this. And what this means is that these people, hardworking, but not making a ton of money, well, the only way they can buy property realistically is through inheritance. It's through the help that comes through generational wealth transfer, whereas these people didn't have any inheritance. They were locked out of this whole system of property ownership and wealth building that is so critical to lifeways these days. So we've showed this to the legislature, and the legislature is doing something pretty neat, really neat. So there is a bill. It's passed the House of Representatives, one part of the legislature. You call it the Assembly in California, and it's now coming to the Senate next week, and chances are it's going to pass. And what it does is it tries to compensate the victims of this, to compensate those who were harmed by the exclusions, the racial restrictive covenants, the redlining, the other forms of racist exclusions in past generations. And the logic of the bill is the state of Washington and the state of California authorized, supported, and promoted this form of racial restriction. And so the state is responsible for compensating the victims. And it's that logic and some other careful parts of the bill that hopefully are going to survive court challenges, because California and Washington state are both anti-affirmative action states. But this is not affirmative action. This is about compensating people who have literally been harmed. And so the bill will provide down payment assistance, helping, people with modest incomes. Income has to be at or below the median for the area, which can be pretty high in, Seattle and San Francisco, and probably not so high in Bakersfield. But at or below that median, first-time home buyers who either suffered racial discrimination prior to 1968 or are descendants of those who did. So it's literally trying to find, identify, and help to compensate for the damage that was done over the generations, and that continues to be part of the problem of racial disparities. Okay, I don't know how much time I've taken, probably too much, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and hopefully somebody...
that was wonderful, Jeb. You deserve a moment to catch your breath. So, I definitely want to encourage folks in the audience, again, to keep dropping questions in the chat or the Q&A box. And I also just want to give my own kind of reactions to lead off. And again, also, I sent a message to historian Sean Schwaller, who's in the audience. Sean would love to introduce you to James Gregory, given your work on Bakersfield. But a couple of things, James or Jim, your story about Union Avenue, oh my gosh, like Union was the historic kind of dividing line in Bakersfield for racial segregation. I also dropped in the chat, some people were asking about how the racial covenants would look in Bakersfield. Some folks at the Historical Research Center at CSUB, which houses the Odyssey Project, they're now starting to do that mapping, going in and looking at the neighborhood restrictions, and just making the maps is the tough part, I think, but we have some GIS folks that we're working with. My question or comment to you, though, is actually about GIS and the way that you involve students in the project. I know that you started doing this like in 07, 08 in a very robust way. I'm just wondering if you can talk briefly about the technology, like how was that a huge learning curve for you, or how do you foresee technological changes impacting the kind of website design or future projects that you or your colleagues might be involved with?
Well, technology is a huge challenge, and I've sort of felt my way through this and learn as I go, and had a lot of really smart students who know how to do things that I don't, and then they teach me, and I try and keep it going. So, this is a kind of it's a community project. All of these, lots and lots of people helping. And my approach to it all is, try and do what I can with people who want to do stuff and follow their lead and try to be modest. I mean, so none of these projects are as swoopy as, University of Richmond can just do, and Stanford can do these amazing things, and they have millions of dollars, and I'm happy for them, but I don't have that and can't do it. So I think, for you all starting to do this great project that you're going to do, I think being somewhat modest, don't shoot for, the goalposts on the first, do what you can. I would counsel that websites and all digital projects have a half-life about the duration of a rabbit. If you're not careful, it'll go dead, because one of the companies will change the software, and then you're stuck.
Yeah, but you said you still had 1.5 million hits a year. That's amazing. Wow, that's a great statistic. There was a question from Cynthia Rodriguez. I believe she's a student. She said, maybe I missed it, I'm sorry, but who would put those racially restrictive covenants on these areas that you studied? What was the state mechanism? How did that work?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking that. So these would be done in different ways, usually by developers, the person or family or company that plotted out a big area of land and subdivided it and registered what's called a plat with the county. And sometimes they would just put that right in the plat. There'd be the map showing the streets and then a little inscription about who couldn't live there. And then that would permanently bind all those properties when and if they were sold. In other cases, real estate companies would run campaigns to encourage people in a particular neighborhood. And in some cases, neighborhood associations would get together and they would impose restrictions retroactively, especially in older neighborhoods. It was pretty hard to do that. So we found quite a few, but if you looked at that Seattle map, the areas that were unmarked, some of them were segregated. They just weren't segregated on the basis of these covenants because they were older areas and it was kind of hard to go back and impose these. But the bottom line is that the real estate industry, so the National Board of Realtors, which is still the association, and all the local boards were very diligently organizing these campaigns starting in the 1920s and all the way through the 1940s. And then it sort of peters out after that.
Didn't the Realtors Board recently making a public apology for their role in creating racial restrictive covenants and segregation?
Yeah, and in our state, this law that is going through the legislature, part of the reason it's going through the legislature is the Real Estate Association came out in favor of it and said, in effect, yeah, we did some bad stuff and this deserves to be made right. So
I appreciate you sharing that. There's a great comment in the chat from Patricia Weisner, I believe. She says, the Bakersfield Sound is still very active. My brother, who is a musician, builds guitars and worked at Frenchport Music downtown for over a decade. And he also built a guitar for Merle Haggard out of pieces from his old boxcar.
wow, that is very cool.
That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that, Patricia.
Yeah,
There was another comment or a question in the box from an anonymous attendee. They said, what were some examples of the Great Migration's impact upon religion? And I know that's something that I know you addressed in Exodus and whatnot.
yeah, in both books. So what we think of as evangelical churches, religious movements, so Pentecostal holiness, Southern Baptists, all of those really were not part of California or New York or Chicago or anywhere else until the Great Migrations, the two of them. And it was Southerners bringing those forms, institutional and in terms of style, North and West, that made all those churches now everywhere. And also made, and the growth of the evangelical movements piggyback, it started with diaspora folks, and then they become attractive to other people as well. So it's not like the only people going to Southern Baptist churches are former Southerners. It's grown much bigger than that, but it starts with, that's like the seed bed for these transformations in American religion that have been so important. And a similar story about music and the rest.
Yeah, I know with Latino Pentecostalism, there's a new book from Oxford Press by a scholar named Barba. And he, I think he has roots in the South Current area, but it's on the history of Latino Pentecostalism with a heavy focus on the Central Valley. And we're going to try to bring him at some point in the future. So there was another comment from Vincent Zaragoza in the chat. He said, in addition to historical race restrictions by local governments in the 1940s and 1950s, the FHA promulgated federal housing policies which mandated segregation. This is outlined in Rothstein's book entitled The Color of Law. So that sort of interplay between local restrictions on the ground and then the role of the federal government. I found the chart that you shared. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about where you found some of that data on tracking home ownership or the decline from the 60s through present. Is that census data?
Yeah, that's census data. Yeah, decade by decade, you can download. So I use census data for lots. All those migration studies are based on census data, state of birth, nation of birth, things like that. Yeah.
When you were mining some of that data, was anything surprising that you hadn't sort of anticipated that you would find? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So which are you thinking?
Well, especially about the stuff on property ownership. I mean, I'm just kind of curious if any of that data, it affirms your suspicions, or wow, I didn't expect to see this when I put the data together.
Yeah. So their government sources have been reporting the differential homeownership rate currently for the state of Washington. And they tend to do it in a kind of people of color versus white people. And those numbers are bad. But breaking it up by racial group and showing the trend over time is something that we've done for the first time. And that, I think, has been eye-opening. And especially the fact that Black homeownership rate and Latinx homeownership rate have both declined since 1970. So it's like 1970 is pretty much the high point for African-American homeownership, and after that in King County, but it's also somewhat for several other counties. To some extent, you also have to look at it county by county. This idea of doing California, Bakersfield is really different from Kern County and Marin County are super different. So it's like, what? And we have the same issues in Washington. You need to kind of look at it at the lived level, which would be the county level.
One thing I wanted to make sure I connect, and again, I don't know if he's still here, Sean Schwaller, when you asked about Bakersfield today or the endurance of some of the themes that you talked about. Sean is a historian at Chico State, and he wrote a really wonderful article in Boom, California, published by UC Press, and it was basically charting. The Guardian, the British newspaper, did this expose. Oh, he's here, Sean. I don't know if you want to tell James a little bit about your work, but I'll just say, Sean, that we really appreciate you in the work that you've done, sort of, trying to put the history of police violence today in a kind of historical context. Did you want to say something, Sean? Oh, he might have stepped away. I'm not sure. He might be on mute.
Yeah, I think it's mute.
Oh, there you go, Sean. Are you there?
You're muted again. Have to unmute.
I did see him try to unmute.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Very happy to hear you talk, James. Those websites and those projects, those digital projects, are absolutely amazing. I wasn't expecting to come on here.
Oh no! Well, we're so glad to have you, Sean. But yeah, your article in Boom, when James is talking about the history of Bakersfield and how it connects to today, I think your article really does that brilliantly. So even for the students who are here, Sean, if you just want to really just a quick summary of what you wrote about in Boom.
So I covered recent law enforcement killings in Kern County, especially around 2015 when it had the most per capita among all U.S. counties, law enforcement involved killings.
Whoa.
And some white supremacist street violence in the area, and a lot of anti-Mexican racism when Trump was running for for president, and also law enforcement corruption. So all really happy topics, but I was looking to explore Republican spaces in California in the contemporary era, and Bakersfield just kept coming up. I didn't set out to write about any of those things, but it just kept coming up, and I said, well, there's an article here, and I wrote it, and it got into Boom, and a lot of readers, and was very happy to help shine a light on those things.
That's really important. Yeah.
Right, and Sean was most recently in the Hulu documentary on this topic, right? With published by Kaepernick. Is that right, Sean?
Yeah, Kaepernick was the executive producer, and then it was also produced by ABC News, and it is on Hulu right now, a 3-part series. I think, well, most of what I said is on a cutting room floor, but I made it into a couple seconds in episode 2.
Well, thank you for sharing, John. And Jim, I just wanted to let you know that your scholarship has impacted a lot of scholars who write about the Valley. So thank you, Sean. Maybe time for just one more comment here from Vince Zaragoza. He wrote in the Q&A. He said, my undergraduate major was economics, but I minored in history, which was fascinating. My graduate degree is in geography with a GIS focus. I am of the opinion all colleges should strive to provide courses such as GIS to all students, including those majoring in social sciences, history, and the humanities. And then he recommends a reading called Applying GIS. Again, I guess maybe to kind of round things out, James, you started off as kind of the bookish academic, and you've moved into these new kind of mapping worlds and digital history projects. I mean, do you have any kind of comments either for the students or teachers, and what do you see kind of as the future potential for digital history, digital humanities?
Well, I think it's going in lots of great directions. I would just second the geographer part. I mean, I am a geographer. I'm a historical geographer. From that very first book about people moving from one region to another, that's about the importance of geography and how social change flows out of something as kind of simple as a moving person, and especially a lot of them can really make quite a difference. So, yeah, I think the world is wide open, and a lot of great stuff is happening. And some of the tools, and the tools are becoming easier. So you see all these maps; those are produced on the Tableau public site. So that's completely free platform. It's not very difficult to learn. I mean, it's not something you learn in a weekend, but compared to ArcGIS and some other systems that are potentially more accurate in the long run, and can do some things that Tableau can't, but Tableau is pretty accessible. So if you're thinking about doing certainly maps, charts, Tableau is mostly famous for charting, tables and things like that, but the mapping capacity, as you can see, is pretty robust. And yeah, so I've always tried to use fairly simple tools because, yeah, that's where my expertise kind of runs out at a certain point. Plus, I've been something of I've always been cautious about these technologies because, as I said, Microsoft, Tableau, one of these companies, I've had to migrate things so many times because, the company thinks, oh, well, that's old, let's just change it. And now you're stuck.
Oh no, I appreciate you sharing that, and you've inspired me as a grant writer. I think Bakersfield Kern County is ready for a digital history grant to try to bring together the projects and scholars to promote it more. It needs to happen. So thank you so much for being here. We've approached the end of our evening. Before we let everybody go, I just want to say that in about a month, on Friday, April, I think it's 14th, we're going to have our final speaker series for the Mapping Common History Project. This book, brand new book by Berkeley Assistant Professor Christian Pais on the Strikers of Coachella, a rank and file history of the United Farm Workers. I'm halfway through it, and he talks a lot about Delano in Kern County and Bakersfield, as well as Coachella, and trying to draw out a rank and file history of the United Farm Workers. So I'm very excited to see him. We hope everybody comes to that event as well. But again, thank you, James Gregory, for being here. I give you a virtual round of applause. Hope maybe one day in the future we can actually rope you into coming to Kern County again since 1979.
Yeah, I've got to go by the Plaza Motel and see if that is a topper. Anyway, thank you so much. And, it's been a real pleasure. And I would love to, at some point, come back and really see Bakersfield and listen to the accents. That's what I really want to know. How do people talk nowadays? Yeah, and Oliver and Andrew, this project you're starting is super important, and let me know if I can help.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a wonderful night.